In 1954, the British elite was shaken to its core. A powerful aristocrat, a wealthy landowner, and a prominent journalist were thrust into the epicenter of a historic trial. The reason? The exposure of a secret same-sex affair. This is the story of three men, hidden love letters, and a trial that forever shattered the legal foundations of an entire nation. The year was 1954, and the setting was a sterile, unforgiving courtroom that would soon become the focal point of a national scandal. Standing before the magistrate were three men who, under any other circumstance, would be insulated by the formidable walls of British privilege. The first was a young, immensely wealthy aristocrat whose title and vast estate were cornerstones of the rural establishment. The second was a landed gentleman, a quiet but powerful presence in the upper echelons of society. The third was a highly educated journalist, navigating the fast-paced, modern world of London's media landscape. Despite the vast differences in their daily realities, they were bound by a single dangerous commonality: an emotional and physical life with other men that the law dictated they must suppress. All three had painstakingly constructed outwardly normal, highly visible public lives. They had played by the rules of a rigid society, fulfilling their professional and social obligations with the utmost precision. A single police investigation shattered that fragile equilibrium. The courtroom became an arena where the most intimate corners of their existence were violently dragged into the light. Confidential police files, coerced testimonies, and sensationalized newspaper columns converged to strip them of their autonomy. This was not merely a legal proceeding. It was the systematic dismantling of three men who had entirely lost control over the narrative of their own private lives. Edward Douglas Scott Montagu, born in 1926, inherited the formidable title of Baron Montagu of Beaulieu when he was just a child. His existence was intrinsically linked to the sprawling Beaulieu estate, the expectations of the aristocracy, and a relentless schedule of high society engagements. He carried the heavy burden of family responsibility and the constant maintenance of a pristine public image. However, behind the grand facade of aristocratic duty, Montagu navigated a complex emotional landscape, harboring affections for both men and women. In the suffocating atmosphere of mid-century Britain, his relationships with men had to be buried beneath layers of strict secrecy. The contradiction of Montagu's life was stark and unrelenting. A lord of the realm could be seen everywhere, at exclusive social galas, within the cloistered halls of Parliament, and on the front pages of society papers. But he was fundamentally barred from living his emotional truth openly. His high social standing offered a veneer of protection, but it could not erase the persistent, gnawing fear of discovery. A single misstep meant not only personal ruin, but the public degradation of his family name, the tarnishing of his title, and a permanent loss of honor within a society that rarely forgave such transgressions. Michael Pitt Rivers occupied a slightly different, though equally precarious, position in the social hierarchy. He was a man born into immense rural wealth, a landowner whose assets and status granted him a degree of personal freedom far beyond the reach of the average British citizen. Yet this economic independence did not translate into emotional liberty. Pitt Rivers lived a carefully compartmentalized existence, forced to weigh the risk of every social interaction. He had to be meticulously cautious about the company he kept, the words he committed to paper, and the acquaintances who might, under pressure, betray him to the authorities. His presence in the courtroom alongside Montagu demonstrated a chilling reality. Immense wealth and aristocratic pedigree might buy a temporary veil of privacy, but they were powerless against the unyielding machinery of the law and the sheer force of a public scandal. Peter Wildeblood represented the most profound psychological anchor of the trio. As a journalist, he was a creature of the city, educated, urban, and deeply embedded in a relatively modern, progressive professional environment. Yet his private reality was sharply divorced from his articulate public-facing persona. Wildeblood's situation fundamentally elevated the stakes of the trial, shifting it from a sterile legal debate about illicit acts into a deeply human tragedy. He did not merely engage in fleeting, clandestine encounters. He harbored genuine, profound romantic feelings for another man. This emotional reality is the absolute core of Wildeblood's ordeal. The prosecution did not merely target isolated behaviors, they targeted a legitimate human connection, twisting it into criminal evidence. The affection he held, the letters he wrote, and the moments of intimacy he shared were weaponized by the state, turning the very fabric of a real relationship into the instrument of his own destruction. For a man in 1950s Britain, loving another man required the tactical precision of a fugitive. Every interaction was weighed against the absolute certainty of ruin. Where could they meet? Who was observing them from across the street? Would a landlady notice an unfamiliar coat on the rack? Could a lifelong friend be trusted with a secret, or would a careless remark uttered in a crowded tavern eventually reach the wrong ears? The psychological toll of this existence was immense and unrelenting. Affection, which should be a spontaneous and natural human emotion, was forcibly transformed into something that had to be rigorously scheduled, heavily disguised, and constantly monitored. It was a life lived entirely on the defensive. The secret was not a minor detail tucked away in the background. It was the central organizing principle of their entire existence. The shift from private anxiety to active looming danger began when Lord Montagu first fell under the intense scrutiny of Scotland Yard. Long before the defining courtroom confrontation of 1954, he was already being tracked. For a peer of the realm, the implications of police surveillance were catastrophic. The authorities were not merely investigating an individual. They were interrogating a centuries-old legacy, the Beaulieu estate, the Douglas Scott Montagu name, the ancestral dignity. All of it was suddenly vulnerable to the cold, bureaucratic entries of a police docket. Montagu was trapped in a suffocating vice. He faced the crushing weight of family expectations, the frantic warnings of expensive legal counsel, and the looming predatory specter of the British press. A scandal of this magnitude would not merely end his social standing, it threatened to obliterate the historical dignity of his bloodline. He was a man standing on a pedestal, fully aware that the very foundation was being chipped away. The investigation soon took on a cold, forensic ruthlessness. Detectives began the meticulous, chilling process of reconstructing private time. They traced movements, verified dates, and mapped out specific locations down to the hour. Who attended the weekend gathering at Montagu's beach hut? Who slept in which room? Who departed at dawn and who stayed behind? Moments that were once intimate, tender, and shielded from the world were abruptly pinned down and dissected under a harsh, unforgiving light. The true terror for these men was not just the immediate threat of a prison cell. It was the profound psychological violation of watching hostile strangers aggressively unearth, examine, and judge the very core of their existence. Every quiet conversation, every shared glance, was stripped of its humanity and reclassified as criminal evidence. The fragile structure of this hidden world ultimately shattered upon the shoulders of two young men. Edward McNally and John Reynolds were corporals in the Royal Air Force. They were not masterminds of high society. They were ordinary servicemen caught in a ruthless legal vise. When Scotland Yard detectives cornered them, the power dynamic was brutally clear and heavily skewed. These young men faced severe military dishonor and harsh criminal consequences. The police required corroborating witnesses to build their case against the elite, and they applied the precise amount of pressure needed to extract names, dates, and confessions. The terror of imprisonment, the primal instinct for self-preservation, and the sheer intimidation of state authority forced them to speak. Their testimonies demonstrated a terrifying truth about living in the shadows. A clandestine network, no matter how carefully built on trust and wealth, can be entirely destroyed. The moment one terrified individual decides to break the silence to save himself. The relationship between Peter Wildeblood and Edward McNally sat at the absolute center of this tragedy, distinguishing the case from a standard vice sting and elevating it into a profound moral conflict. This was not a passing transaction in a shadowed alleyway. Wildeblood harbored a deep, sustained emotional attachment to the young corporal. He did what anyone in love does. He reached out. He wrote letters. He put his affections, his daily thoughts, and his longing onto paper, folding them into envelopes and trusting them to the postal service. He maintained a steady line of communication that tethered his fast-paced London life to McNally's regimented military existence. In any ordinary context, a love letter is a private sanctuary. It is a physical manifestation of trust, something to be kept in a drawer, reread in quiet moments, and cherished. But under the unforgiving statutes of 1950s British law, a letter expressing affection between two men was highly dangerous contraband. When Scotland Yard intercepted this correspondence, the fundamental nature of the words was violently altered. Sentences written in vulnerability were stripped of their humanity and catalogued as confessions of guilt. Expressions of care became documented proof of a conspiracy to commit indecent offenses. The prosecution did not need to catch them in an illicit act. Wildeblood's own earnest attempts to build a meaningful connection provided the state with the exact ammunition required to destroy him. The investigation quickly breached the walls of their carefully compartmentalized lives. A man living a hidden existence during this era operated by silently categorizing everyone he met. There were the very few who knew the truth, the handful who might quietly suspect, and the vast majority, family, employers, the general public, who were completely oblivious. The police investigation acted as a sledgehammer to these delicate boundaries. The terrifying realization for the accused was not just the prospect of facing a judge, but the sudden, irreversible exposure to their own families and colleagues. For Lord Montagu, the investigation meant that the closely guarded secrets of his private life were suddenly being discussed in the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. The detectives were asking questions that his own relatives would never dare voice. The legacy of Beaulieu was being scrutinized not by historians, but by police inspectors looking for moral failings. For Michael Pitt Rivers, the quiet respectability of his country life evaporated, replaced by whispers among the landed gentry and the sudden, glaring realization that his money and pedigree were useless shields against public disgrace. For Wildeblood, the collapse of these spheres was perhaps the most acute. He worked in Fleet Street, the very nerve center of British journalism. He knew exactly how the press operated, how it hunted, and how it devoured its subjects. Now, the professional world he navigated daily was preparing to turn its predatory gaze upon him. His career, his intellectual reputation, and his public standing were standing on a trapdoor. The terrible anxiety of this period lay in the waiting, the agonizing countdown, to the moment when the people they loved, the people they worked with, and the people they commanded would read about their most private acts in the morning papers. The transition from a police investigation to a national scandal was swift and brutal. The British press in 1954 seized upon the story with an intense, ravenous energy. A lord of the realm, a wealthy landowner, and a prominent journalist caught in a homosexual ring was not just a news item. It was a societal earthquake. The moment the story broke, the private lives of Montagu, Pitt Rivers, and Wildeblood ceased to belong to them. Details that had previously existed only behind locked doors, in sealed envelopes, or in whispered conversations were now splashed across the front pages in bold, condemning ink. The newspapers dictated the narrative with absolute authority. They framed the accused not as human beings caught in a legal trap, but as a symptom of elite moral decay. The press had the power to define them as criminals, as tragedies, or as pariahs, and the men themselves had zero agency to correct the record. They were forced to watch as their identities were flattened into grotesque caricatures for public consumption. Before the scandal erupted, their greatest daily burden had been the exhausting effort of hiding. Once the headlines hit the newsstands, that specific fear vanished, replaced by something far worse, the devastating clarity of complete exposure. There was nothing left to conceal. The damage was total. The entire nation was now looking at them, judging them, and waiting for the final gavel to fall. As the sheer scale of the crisis solidified, the three men were forced to confront the impending destruction of their worlds. They were united in their legal peril, but their reactions were strictly dictated by the distinct lives they had built. They did not face the law as equals. They faced it armed with different priorities and different fears. For Lord Montague, the impending trial was not just a threat to his personal liberty. It was an existential threat to an institution. His primary directive was preservation. He had to protect the Douglas Scott Montague name, his family, his standing within the aristocracy, and above all, the Beaulieu estate. His defense was naturally molded by these immense responsibilities. He was fighting to keep a legacy intact. The strategy demanded a rigid adherence to the established rules of his class. Project absolute confidence, deny the accusations with aristocratic indignation, and utilize the most formidable legal minds available to dismantle the prosecution's witnesses. He was a lord of the realm defending his castle from a siege, fully aware that a conviction would stain a bloodline that had taken generations to cultivate. Michael Pitt Rivers confronted a different kind of erosion. His wealth and status as a country squire had always insulated him from the harsher realities of British society. He was a man accustomed to a quiet, unquestioned authority over his lands and his life. The investigation shattered that peace, forcing him into a glare he had spent his life avoiding. For Pitt Rivers, the impending disaster was the total annihilation of his privacy and his dignity within the elite social circles he occupied. His money could hire excellent barristers, but it could not buy back the respect of the landed gentry, nor could it silence the vicious rumors circulating through the exclusive clubs of London. He was forced to endure the agonizing realization that his class status, previously an impenetrable shield, was completely useless in halting the public spectacle being made of his private life. Peter Wildeblood, however, stood at a completely different crossroads. Without an ancestral estate to protect or vast rural wealth to hide behind, his crisis was profoundly internal. He was an intellectual, a writer who had spent his career observing and analyzing society. Now he was the subject of its most brutal scrutiny. While Montague and Pitt Rivers were primarily focused on defending their external legacies, Wildeblood was forced to grapple with a devastating internal question. Would he continue to deny the fundamental reality of his own existence to appease a court that already despised him? The legal strategy dictated absolute denial, a firm rejection of any homosexual identity. But for Wildeblood, playing that game meant actively participating in the suppression of his own humanity. When the trial finally commenced in the spring of 1954, the courtroom transformed into a theater of severe psychological dissection. The physical space itself was designed to intimidate, an arena where the immense power of the British state was concentrated against the defendants. It was here that the ultimate violation of their privacy occurred. There was no need for physical violence. The violence was entirely verbal and procedural. Barristers in formal robes stood before a packed gallery and clinically dismantled the private lives of the three men. Every detail of their existence was subjected to forensic analysis. The prosecution interrogated the nature of their friendships, the layout of their homes, the contents of their personal letters, and the identities of their guests. They discussed sleeping arrangements and private conversations with the cold, detached precision of surgeons dissecting a cadaver. For the men in the dock, this was an experience of absolute powerlessness. They were forced to sit in silence while strangers aggressively analyzed their emotional and physical lives. They had to listen as their affections were redefined as pathology and their private gatherings were characterized as criminal conspiracies. The press gallery furiously scribbled every sordid detail, ensuring that the humiliation occurring within the courtroom would be broadcast to millions of breakfast tables across the country the following morning. They were stripped of the right to define their own actions. The narrative belonged entirely to the prosecution, the judge, and the journalists. In the midst of this systematic degradation, Peter Wildeblood executed a maneuver that fundamentally altered the historical trajectory of the trial. In a legal environment where survival depended entirely on aggressive denial and the distancing of oneself from any homosexual association, Wildeblood took the witness stand and made a calculated, astonishing decision. He admitted it. Under the crushing pressure of cross-examination, Wildeblood openly acknowledged his homosexuality to the court. He refused to pretend he was a victim of circumstance or simply a man caught in a misunderstanding. He stated clearly and on the public record the reality of his nature. This was an act of extraordinary defiance. In 1954, such an admission was virtually unheard of. It was the equivalent of handing a loaded weapon directly to the firing squad. It guaranteed his conviction, permanently destroyed his mainstream journalistic career, and solidified his status as a social pariah. Yet, the significance of this moment cannot be overstated. By speaking the truth, Wildeblood seized a crucial fragment of control back from the state. He refused to let the prosecution entirely dictate the terms of his existence. He shifted his position from a cornered, defensive suspect into a man taking ownership of his own life. The courtroom expected a cowering deviant pleading for mercy. Instead, they were forced to look at an articulate, educated man who refused to apologize for who he was. It was the critical turning point of the entire ordeal. Wildeblood had stopped hiding, and in doing so, he set the stage for a much larger confrontation with the society that was preparing to lock him away. The gavel fell, and the transition was instantaneous. Lord Montagu received 12 months. Michael Pitt Reevers and Peter Wildeblood were sentenced to 18. In a matter of seconds, the immense social privileges that had defined their entire existence evaporated. The day before, Montagu was the master of Beaulieu, Pitt Rivers a wealthy country squire, and Wildeblood a respected voice of Fleet Street. The moment the judge delivered the sentences, they were stripped of their names, their bespoke suits, and their autonomy. They were escorted from the courtroom not as gentlemen of standing, but as inmates of the British penal system. The physical loss of liberty was harsh, but the psychological dispossession was total. They were incarcerated, but they had also lost the fundamental right to control how society perceived them. The press had permanently etched their identities as national disgraces. Their reputations, built over a lifetime of careful social maneuvering and professional achievement, were reduced to a singular, criminalized aspect of their private lives. The elite status that had previously opened every door in Britain was decisively set aside, replaced by the grim, uniform reality of prison walls. For Wildeblood, being sent to Wormwood Scrubs triggered a profound psychological metamorphosis. His career as a journalist had always positioned him as an observer, a man who documented the struggles of others from a comfortable distance. Prison forcefully relocated him from the observer's desk to the very bottom of the institutional hierarchy. He was no longer reporting on the system, he was surviving it. He wore the rough prison garb, adhered to the brutal schedule, and endured the casual indignities inflicted by wardens. He was forced to exist within the precise machinery of punishment that had just destroyed his life. Within the cold confines of the prison, Wildeblood's perspective fractured and reformed. As he lived alongside the general population, the narrow elite context of his own scandal fell away. He encountered dozens of other homosexual men serving time. These were not aristocrats or wealthy landowners. They were factory workers, clerks, and laborers. They had no press coverage, no access to prominent defense attorneys, and no public debate surrounding their arrests. They were simply swept up, convicted, and locked away in complete silence. This exposure fundamentally shifted Wildeblood's understanding of his own ordeal. He stopped viewing his conviction as a localized disaster affecting 3 prominent men. He saw the industrial scale of the persecution. The law was not just targeting the elite who slipped up. It was a vast, predatory net cast over thousands of ordinary citizens. His personal tragedy was a symptom of a massive, systemic injustice that demanded absolute conformity through the threat of state violence. When Wildeblood was released from prison, he did not retreat into the shadows. Armed with the harsh clarity of his incarceration, he executed the second major climax of his life. He sat down and wrote a book titled Against the Law. Before the trial, Wildeblood had spent his life meticulously hiding his identity. During the trial, his most private secrets were aggressively exposed and weaponized by the state. With the publication of Against the Law, Wildeblood forcefully seized the narrative back. He refused to be the passive subject of a scandal, a cautionary tale whispered about in polite society. The book was a direct, unapologetic offensive. He detailed the trial and the grim reality of prison life, but he pushed far beyond the boundaries of a simple memoir. Wildeblood dissected the very experience of living as a homosexual man in mid-century Britain. He exposed the relentless fear, the forced pretense, and the crippling pressure of a society that criminalized love. He explained the constant vulnerability to blackmail and the psychological damage inflicted by a law that turned citizens into hunted criminals. By publishing this account, Wildeblood completed a critical transformation. He evolved from an object described by hostile prosecutors and sensationalist journalists into a man describing his own reality on his own terms. He laid the brutal facts of his existence before the British public, demanding that they look at the human cost of their laws. He was no longer a disgraced defendant. He had become the accuser. Lord Edward Montagu's release from prison presented a completely different set of challenges. When the heavy gates swung open, he did not step into the liberating anonymity that a commoner might find, nor did he possess the fiery, crusading zeal that now fueled Peter Wildeblood. Montagu stepped right back into the suffocating glare of the British aristocracy. He carried the indelible stain of a criminal conviction for gross indecency, an offense that polite society considered entirely unforgivable. For a peer of the realm, this was a social death sentence. The standard protocol for an aristocrat disgraced in such a spectacular manner was immediate exile, a quiet retreat to the continent, a lifetime of tax evasion on the French Riviera, and a permanent erasure from the public rolls of the British establishment. Montagu rejected the protocol. He made a decision that was as strategic as it was stubborn. He returned directly to Beaulieu. His survival strategy relied on his immense inheritance. Montagu understood that while society might despise his private life, it held a deep reverence for historical estates. He had already opened a small motor museum at Beaulieu in 1952, prior to his arrest. After prison, instead of hiding, he anchored his entire rehabilitation to this land. He relentlessly expanded the Beaulieu attraction, eventually transforming his ancestral home into the massive National Motor Museum, forcing the public to engage with him as a cultural visionary rather than a convicted felon. This was not a rapid redemption. Rebuilding his reputation was an exhausting, decades-long campaign. The scandal never truly vanished. It simply became a silent, ever-present shadow that trailed him through every boardroom meeting, every public appearance, and every interaction with the press. People remembered, but Montagu forced them to look at what he was building rather than what he had been convicted of. He demonstrated a profound reality of aristocratic survival. A public unmasking does not necessarily mean the end of a life, provided one has the capital, the land, and the sheer endurance to outlast the memory of the mob. He managed to construct a highly visible, incredibly successful public life, effectively building a fortress of respectability over the ruins of his private disgrace. Michael Pitt Rivers pursued a third, distinct path, one that makes him the least remembered of the three, yet perhaps the most illustrative of the fragility of the British class system. While Montagu leveraged his estate to command public attention, and Wildeblood used his intellect to challenge the law, Pitt Rivers slipped away into the protective silence of extreme wealth. He was the wealthiest of the trio, a landed gentleman with vast properties in Dorset. After his release from prison, he retreated entirely from the national gaze. His story is often swallowed by the overwhelming gravity of Lord Montagu and the sharp, vocal defiance of Peter Wildeblood. But Pitt Rivers's quiet withdrawal serves a crucial narrative purpose. He embodies the absolute limit of what money and status can achieve. Before the trial, his wealth and rural isolation provided a comfortable illusion of invulnerability. He operated under the assumption that his class protected him from the crude mechanics of police raids and tabloid gossip. The scandal violently corrected that assumption. When Pitt Rivers returned to his estates, he returned as a fundamentally altered man in the eyes of his peers. The money was still there, the land was still there, but the unquestioned dignity of his position was gone. He could retreat behind high walls and iron gates, insulating himself from the sneers of the general public, but he could never undo the fact that he had been dragged through a criminal court and exposed to the entire nation. His wealth allowed him to survive the aftermath in comfort, but it was completely powerless to restore the unquestioned social authority he had lost. In the immediate aftermath of 1954, these three men represented three entirely different survival strategies within the exact same oppressive society. Lord Montagu chose the path of aristocratic endurance, balancing his scandalous history with aggressive public duty and the commercialization of his heritage. Michael Pitt Rivers chose the path of wealthy seclusion, relying on rural isolation to shield him from a society that had stripped him of his dignity. Peter Wildeblood chose the path of absolute confrontation, abandoning the rules of the elite entirely to launch a public, intellectual assault on the laws that had ruined them all. They had stood in the exact same courtroom, faced the exact same charges, and suffered under the exact same law. Yet, their varying degrees of wealth, title, and profession dictated completely different realities once they walked out of prison. They were living proof that there was no singular homosexual experience in mid-century Britain. Survival was entirely dependent on the specific weapons a man had at his disposal. While Lord Edward Montagu was undeniably the explosive catalyst of the scandal, Peter Wildeblood became its enduring historical architect. When the arrests first detonated across the national consciousness, Montagu was the ultimate prize for the press. He possessed the title, the castle, the ancient lineage, and the aristocratic glamour. The newspapers obsessed over the spectacular fall of a baron. But history requires more than a sensational headline to pivot. It requires a clear, human voice to articulate the damage. Montagu survived the aftermath by strategically navigating around his conviction, utilizing his wealth to force society to look at his business achievements rather than his private life. Wildeblood survived by driving straight through the center of his conviction. By writing and publishing his account of the trial and his subsequent imprisonment, Wildeblood transformed a fleeting tabloid frenzy into a permanent, undeniable historical record. He executed the one maneuver the British legal system was completely unprepared for. He refused to be ashamed. He stood before the public, a convicted felon stripped of his elite standing, and meticulously articulated the precise mechanics of his own oppression. He humanized the abstract, heavily politicized concept of the homosexual menace. While Montagu made the public look at the scandal, Wildeblood made the public understand the human beings trapped inside it. He shifted the focus from the sensational details of who slept in which bedroom to the devastating reality of a state that hunted its own citizens. The 1954 trial did not merely ruin three men, it fractured the British public's unquestioning faith in their own legal system. Prior to this highly publicized prosecution, the strict policing of private morality was largely accepted as a necessary, unquestioned function of the government. However, watching the state expend massive resources to relentlessly tear apart the lives of consenting adults, weaponizing personal correspondence, coercing military personnel into testifying, and turning private homes into crime scenes forced a critical nationwide realization. The sheer brutality and absolute thoroughness of the prosecution sparked a severe backlash. Citizens began to ask a dangerous question. Was this aggressive destruction of private lives actually serving the public good, or was it merely an exercise in state cruelty? The government, facing mounting public unease and a growing consensus that the police had drastically overreached, was forced to act. They convened the Wolfenden Committee. This was not a sudden, enlightened embrace of progressive social ideals by the ruling class. It was a pragmatic, bureaucratic attempt to manage a legal framework that was rapidly losing its moral authority. The Montague trial had proved that the current laws were practically unenforceable without resorting to totalitarian tactics of surveillance and intimidation. Wildeblood, carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of his recent conviction, stepped before this government committee to testify. He did not offer abstract theories. He provided direct, first-hand evidence of how the law functioned in reality. He explained how it bred systemic blackmail, how it forced innocent people into a life of paralyzing fear, and how it directly contributed to a silent epidemic of suicides among men who saw no other escape. His testimony helped ground the committee's findings in harsh reality. The resulting 1957 Wolfenden Report delivered a shocking conclusion to conservative Britain. It explicitly recommended that homosexual behavior between consenting adults in private should no longer be considered a criminal offense. It would take another decade of brutal political fighting before the law was partially changed in 1967. But the ideological foundation of the state's absolute control over private affection had been fatally cracked by the fallout of the Montague case. To accurately measure the true impact of what happened in 1954, one must look backward to 1895. Nearly 60 years separated the trials of Oscar Wilde and Lord Montague, yet the mechanical processes of their destruction were terrifyingly identical. Both eras deployed the exact same weapons of state power: the sudden police raid, the intercepted personal correspondence, the performative moral outrage of the courtroom, the viciousness of the mainstream press, and the cold, concrete reality of a prison cell. They faced the exact same legal charges. They suffered the exact same public annihilation of their character. But the crucial difference lay not in the men accused, but in the country that condemned them. When Oscar Wilde was convicted and sent to Reading Gaol, the British public felt a deep, righteous vindication. His destruction was widely celebrated as a necessary purging of a moral contagion. Wilde was utterly broken by the system, dying in exile, while the law emerged stronger, more entrenched, and completely unchallenged. 6 decades later, the state applied the exact same aggressive formula to Montague, Pitt Rivers, and Wildeblood. The gavel fell, the cell doors locked, and the newspapers printed their bold condemnations. But this time, the machinery failed to produce the desired social consensus. The destruction of these three men did not reinforce the authority of the law. It exposed its inherent cruelty. The public looked at the wreckage of the 1954 trial and, instead of cheering, began to question the justice system itself. The punishment was exactly the same as it had been for Oscar Wilde, but the reaction proved that Britain had fundamentally changed. The physical confines of Wormwood Scrubs were temporary. The sentences handed down to Montague, Pitt Rivers, and Wildeblood had strict, defined expiration dates. 18 months, 12 months. These were quantifiable units of time that could be served. crossed off a calendar, and eventually left behind. But the true punishment inflicted by the state in 1954 extended far beyond the deprivation of liberty. What these three men actually lost was something invisible, entirely unquantifiable and utterly irrecoverable: the fundamental human right to control their own identities. When a man walks out of a prison gate, his legal debt to the state is paid. His social debt, however, particularly in mid-century Britain, was a lifelong mandate. They lost the right to keep their affections private. They lost the authority to decide who knew their most intimate secrets and who did not. Prior to the trial, they navigated the world with the power of selective disclosure. They could be one person in a London newsroom, another at a Beaulieu dinner party, and someone entirely different behind the closed doors of a private residence. The police investigation and the subsequent media frenzy permanently eradicated those boundaries. They lost the ability to control how society perceived them. Every future interaction was preceded by their reputation. When Lord Montague walked into a room, the scandal walked in before him. When Michael Pitt Rivers conducted business on his estates, the unspoken knowledge of the courtroom transcripts lingered in the minds of his tenants and peers. For Peter Wildeblood, the simple act of pursuing a mainstream journalistic career was obliterated. He could no longer report on the world without the world first judging him as a convicted deviant. Furthermore, they lost the normalcy of human connection. The trauma of the trial fundamentally altered the architecture of trust. How does a man write a letter of affection after watching his own handwritten words read aloud by a hostile prosecutor to secure a criminal conviction? How does one invite a companion into their home after watching police dismantle their private sanctuary to map out sleeping arrangements? The state had taken the most natural human instincts, the desire for companionship, the need for intimacy, and successfully associated them with the terror of surveillance, interrogation, and imprisonment. Even in freedom, the psychological architecture of the closet remained, heavily reinforced by the memory of the courtroom. Yet, history does not remember them simply as victims crushed by the machinery of the state. It remembers them for how they absorbed the blow and forged completely different realities from the wreckage. Lord Edward Montague returned to the aristocratic fold and executed a masterclass in strategic survival. He refused the traditional aristocratic route of quiet exile. He leveraged his land, his title, and his formidable business acumen to build an empire at Beaulieu. He forced the British public to engage with him on his own terms. He proved that a massive public scandal did not mandate a permanent disappearance. By constructing a highly visible, economically powerful public life, he managed to outlast the immediate outrage of his conviction, eventually reclaiming a seat in the House of Lords and cementing his legacy as a pioneer of British heritage preservation. Michael Pitt Rivers lived with the quiet, lingering fallout of a scandal that history would eventually attach more firmly to his co-defendants. He retreated into the vast, insulated wealth of his rural estates. His life stands as a testament to the absolute limits of class privilege. Money and status could provide a comfortable fortress after the fact, but they were fundamentally useless in stopping the state from dragging a deeply private man into a glaring, destructive national spotlight. He survived, but he did so by accepting a permanent withdrawal from the society that had so brutally exposed him. Peter Wildeblood executed the most profound pivot of all. He took the worst experience of his life and forged it into a weapon. He refused to let the state, the press, or polite society write the final chapter of his existence. By publishing his experiences, he transformed his personal humiliation into a very public, highly articulate indictment of British law. He chose not to hide, not to rebuild quietly, but to stand in the center of the wreckage and point an accusing finger directly back at the system. 3 men entered that courtroom in 1954, desperately trying to protect their secrets. They had spent their adult lives building elaborate, exhausting defenses to keep their private affections hidden from a society they knew would destroy them. In the end, the very laws designed to quietly police morality achieved the exact opposite. The state took 3 private lives and broadcast them to the entire nation. That is the enduring legacy of the Montague case. It is not memorable merely because 3 men of high status were caught engaging in illegal acts. It remains a historical flashpoint because a rigid, unforgiving society forced the genuine, private connections of its citizens on a brutal march, dragging their affections out of the bedroom into the harsh fluorescent light of the police station, through the ruthless theater of the courtroom, and finally laying them bare before the entire nation. They paid the ultimate price for loving in secret, but in forcing them to pay it so publicly, the state inadvertently began the dismantling of its own oppressive laws.